Okay, hello everyone and welcome back. So for this video we're going to take a more in-depth look at different damage types and how to select different weapon modes. So the rationale behind this is there are many different weapons in the game and they don't all do damage in the same way. There's many different types of damage and each one is mechanically different, and it's important to understand that in order to get the most out of your fleet. So we're going to go through the sort of main damage types in this video. It's not exhaustive. There's probably some exotic weapons out there that I'm not covering, but all the main ones I'm pretty sure are going to be covered here. Okay, so what I've got here is just a sort of demonstration game that I've set up to sort of demonstrate these different types, and the selection of ships with different types of weapons, and they're going to shoot at these poor Narn. Poor Narn always seems to be the target, or no, it was Primus in previous videos. So there you say, can't say I'm not fair. Right, so how do you find out what kind of damage type your weapon does? Well, usual answer is just to kind of hover over the weapon itself. A tooltip will appear. And you can see two things. Firing mode is standard and damage type is standard. So they're both can both be relevant, but in this case we can safely say that this weapon does damage and fires in standard mode. So let's see what that looks like in practice. It's one of the ships that fired this turn. Alright, so here we have the log for that damage. So it's fired 2 particle blasters. Both do standard damage. They do between 13 and 22 points of damage when they hit. So first thing we can see is 1 out of 2 shots hit, and 1 got intercepted by the Jaquan's guns there. So what that means is we've only got 1 source of damage. The Jaquan was undamaged before, and we can see it's hit from the front and it's hit on its hull. So it's hit for 14, armor mitigation of 5. We can see that there's 5 damage there, and so that means out of a possible 13 to 22, it rolled quite high. It actually rolled 19, and has done 14 points directly onto the hull. Standard damage is essentially called standard for exactly that reason. It takes armor into account, and then after armor's been deducted, it does the remaining damage to that system. In this case, it hit the structure. The structure had 14 points of damage to absorb, so that's what happened. Had it hit on, per se, the energy mine, the armor is 4, so you'd have taken armor mitigation would have been 4, and you'd have done 15 points of damage to that energy mine. But we can see it only has a structure of 5, so the energy mine would have been destroyed, and then you would have 10 points of damage remaining. Standard damage does overkill, and so that 10 points of damage would carry on to the structure, and what you would have seen in that case is that the 10 points of damage, however, would still need to get through the armor 5 of the structure, and the structure would be damaged for 5. So just rattle through that again. When standard damage hits, it takes the armor of the system it hits into account, and then does the remaining damage to the system that it's hit. If that system is destroyed in the process, then any remaining damage will carry over to structure, but will have to penetrate the structure's armor as well. Alright. So standard damage, very common damage type as you would expect, particularly in lighter weapons. So twin arrays, for example, here do damage in standard mode, as do the standard particle beam. Names possibly a hint there, and most, I would say, fighter weapons also do damage in standard, although we're going to come back to fighter weapons because they are also linked. Alright, so that's probably enough for standard. I mean, well, I say that, but the last thing I say, or is worth saying, is like standard weapons, they're reasonably strong because they can do a lot of damage to one system, including structure. What you tend to see is like they don't do huge amounts of damage per single hit, because that would probably be too powerful. So you get sort of medium damage from them or light damage from the lighter weapons, but it's more concentrated, and that will become clear as we look through the other damage types. Okay, so the next one to look at is piercing, because I'm doing these in no particular order. So there was also a piercing shot fired this turn. Let's see what it did. It's the end of the standard shooting, and there we go. A battle laser firing and piercing at target 2 has hit, destroyed a system. Okay, only did 17 damage, which for a battle laser, which is 16 to 52, seems quite low. Let's find out what happened there. Okay, so again Jaquan was undamaged before this shot, and we can see it's taking damage to the front, it's taking damage to the primary hull, taking damage to the rear thruster, and that is because of the characteristic of piercing weapons, which is that they actually punch straight through the enemy ship. So the laser beam has literally gone through the front primary and exited from the rear. In doing so, it rolls to hit in each of those locations, and then the overall damage that was rolled, so in this case 17 plus the mitigated, so it rolled 31 out of a possible 52, so it was actually reasonably low roll. It is divided by 3 when it hits a capital ship, and goes straight through. And a third of your damage rolled is applied to each section. So in this case, that damage was enough to destroy the energy mine, and the damage is applied as standard damage on each of these sections. So it was enough to destroy the energy mine, but wasn't enough to damage the armor. But I got stopped there, because actually 31 divided by 3, we're only talking about 10, 2 scores of 10 damage and 1 score of 11. So that's enough to damage, just destroy an energy mine. Yep, takes 9 damage to do that. The primary, we can see it got reduced by 6 and 5 remaining, so that's where your 11 damage hit. And then at the back here, it should be damaged for, have I counted up badly? Oh, apparently not. Okay, so it's done 7, that's 4, 5, 6. I'm just going to take the game's word for that, because what it seems to have done is actually 11, 11, and presumably 9 in that case. Alright, well, fair enough. I'm not going to mess with the algorithm, but generally speaking, you can see what's happening there. And that's piercing damage. When would you use piercing damage? Because you can see not a lot of damage done there, but it can be useful, say, if a ship's actually almost dead, it's got very low primary structure, but has managed to turn in such a way that it's got a healthy side or front that's shown to you, and you're like, I want to finish that ship off. So if you've got piercing guns, you can pierce through the healthy side and still do damage in the primary, which might destroy it in a way that other weapons couldn't do unless they got a lucky hit in the primary. You can see when I say lucky, I mean primary is normally only a 10% chance to hit from any of the sides or fronts. Again, smaller vessels, piercing damage is not as effective because they have less sides, so like a heavy combat vessel, you still sort of pierce through, but you might only get, I think, 2 sections rather than 3 on that one. Don't quote me on that. But certainly with medium ships, I mean, they only have a single section. I don't think I need to show you, but which means that you only actually get one source of damage on it. I need to look up exactly how much that is, but because you have less sections pass through, the piercing shot literally just goes straight through and doesn't do as much damage to medium vessels. I probably should look that up, but you just need to take my word for it. Okay, so that's piercing damage. Okay, so what's next? Just let the piercing damage finish there, and then we have a heavy laser, classic weapon, hitting for raking damage. So this probably a lot more frequently you'll see this than piercing damage. Very frequent form of damage, and how it works is essentially usually on very heavy weapons that are doing a ton of damage. And what it does is you roll for damage, and then the game will break that damage down into sub-volleys. So again, let's look at the example, let's see what's happened here. You can see it's destroyed 2 energy mines, Heavy laser 24 to 60 damage. It's rolled 21 plus 22, so it's rolled 43 points of damage. And so that would be broken down into 5 sub-volleys, 4 sub-volleys of 10, and 10 is the usual number for a sub-volley. Some weapons vary lower or higher, but 10 is the standard amount of damage for a sub-volley. And then, so that gets you your 40, and then you've got a last final sub-volley, which can be less than 10, in this case 3. So 4 10s and a 3, 43. So how have those sub-volleys been applied? Well, each sub-volley will roll separately for which location they hit, but they will only take armor on each specific location into account once. And what we can see from the heavy laser here is actually it's perhaps unusually not hit the structure at all. So what it's done is raked across the front of this vessel. It's hit the energy mine, which we've already established 10 damage is enough to destroy. It's then raked across another energy mine, so destroyed both of them on this ship. We can see some damage to the heavy laser here, so it's been raked once. You can see armor of 4s come off that sub-volley, and then it's done 6 damage to leave that structure 2 health points out of 8. And then it's done its last of its 4 10-point sub-volleys against the thruster. 5 armor's been reduced, and it's taken 5 structure off that. That left the final sub-volley of 3. Now, we don't know exactly where this is hit. What we can say is it hasn't hit on the heavy laser and it hasn't hit on the thruster, because that 3 damage would go straight through, because the raking shot's already dealt with the armor on both these locations. So the 3 point must have hit one of these other locations, which all have armor 4, 5, 5, meaning that the 3 points of damage wasn't effective in getting through the armor and didn't do any damage to the actual vessel in the end. So, and that's how raking damage essentially works. It rakes across the hull of a vessel. It can be very good, as it has done here, in damaging multiple systems, but it can also, if all of those hits, all 43 of those hits, hit the structure there, it would have done a lot of damage, because the armor would only have applied once, which meant you would have done 38 points of damage to the forward hull with one heavy laser, and which why the heavy laser is such a dangerous weapon. But there's also a random element to it. So like I say, you can rake across it doing damage to this system and that system. Maybe that's what you want. But if you're looking for raw damage, then the dices really need to roll in your favour, and you need to sort of hit the same location over and over. And that's the same for all raking vessels, all raking weapons. So very good. That's how raking damage works. Okay, so for the next set of damage types, I moved the game on a little bit. You can see the Jaquans are now presenting their starboard sides, and that's just so it's easier to talk to. Oh, that's a spoiler. Let's not look at that. So, what are our next damage types? What are our weapons that we're going to fire this turn? Let's find out. So, okay. So what we have here is a heavy pulse cannon. Now, with a few good rolls, these things can be absolutely deadly. So let's have a look at it. It does firing mode pulse, damage type pulse. Okay, damage 15. Well, that doesn't sound very high, but pulse damage, as you'd expect, isn't a single shot, or isn't necessarily a single shot. What you have is here you have pulse mode. If you read the special, D5. So it rolls a 5-sided dice to determine how many pulses it hits with, and it only rolls to hit once. So if you miss, none of your pulses hit. If you hit, you roll the 5-sided dice to see how many standard pulses you have. But there's more. This +1 20%. What that essentially means is you can get extra pulses. You can get a modifier to that dice depending on how well you hit, how accurate you were. And the 20% means that by each 20% that you safely hit, you get +1. So in this case, I had 103% chance to hit. Now, I don't exactly know what that dice rolled, but say, for example, it rolled 60 out of 100. Okay, I've clearly hit by over 40%, because my hit chance was 100, which would give me 20% times 2, which would give me plus 2 to that 5-sided dice. However, there is a maximum, and that maximum is 6 pulses, which, funnily enough, is exactly what we got. So when pulse weapons hit, and they hit for maximum pulses, each pulse will do the 15 damage that's listed there. And so you can see this very quickly adds up, especially since each pulse that hits is doing damage effectively in standard mode. So let's have a look at the poor ship. So ignore the front damage, that was done last turn, and we're looking at the starboard side damage. So one hit has hit the light pulse cannon, and that would take 6 damage, so 9 would carry over onto the hull, 4 would be removed by armour, and so the first, let's say that was the first pulse, well, it destroyed that, and then it did 5 points to the hull. We also got one hit in the thruster, so it took 11 points of damage after armour 4 reduced that, and then the rest of them just slams straight into the hull. Now, unlike Raking Damage, which we discussed earlier, each pulse that hits does have to take armour into account. Okay, so just because you've already hit with one pulse doesn't mean the remaining pulses that hit the structure, in this case, ignore the armour. They all have to take armour into account. But with 6 shots, and one of them carrying over to do 5 points to the hull, and another 4 just slamming straight into the hull, each doing 11 points of damage each, you can see how this adds up to a very large amount of damage. And in fact, they did 64 points of damage, 26 was mitigated by the armour. So 6 times 15, you got 90 damage in total. And as I say, heavy pulse cannons, when they hit for a large number of pulses, or even medium level pulses, they do some real damage. All other pulse weapons, you get light pulse cannons, you get medium pulse cannons, you get other types of weapons that fire in pulse mode. They all follow the same rules for how many pulses are generated, although they may not all do damage in the standard mode. But once you have learned about all the damage types, that won't be such an issue to understand. But the pulse mechanic and how it generates hits essentially can be summed up in: you roll to hit once. Once you've hit, you will have hit between usually a minimum of 1 up to the maximum number of pulses for that weapon, which for normal pulse weapons is 6. Okay. So who do we have next? So I've just replayed. We can see the pulse damage do again. Next up is a matter cannon. So matter cannons are pretty similar to standard damage. Well, are they? They've got a couple of characteristics, but essentially you see actually firing mode standard, damage type standard. Alright, so what that means is when it hits a single system. It doesn't break up its damage like Raking does. It just does all its damage on that system, and then in the case of the matter cannon, does 4 to 22 points of damage. So in this rolled, so actually quite a wide margin there. But you see with this one, this rolled very high. It did 20 out of 22. But you'll also notice the armor mitigation was 0, and that's one of the characteristics of matter weapons. And you get quite a lot of different types of matter weapons in the game, but they ignore armor. They just punch straight through. I think they're essentially just a high velocity projectile that slams into the other ship. So they go straight through the armor, but the other special you see there is does not overkill. So what this means is, in standard damage, I mentioned that if you hit a system, like if you hit one of these lighter systems, you would destroy it, and then any remaining damage would carry over onto the structure. And it's that second part that doesn't happen with the matter cannon. So if it was to hit the light pulse cannon and do 20 points of damage, as it did in this case, it would destroy the light pulse cannon completely. It only takes 6 points of damage to do that, but none of that would carry over. In fact, only 4, because it would ignore the armor. But none of that carries over to the structure, and so that's the other characteristic of matter guns. When they do hit the hull and they roll okay, they do quite a lot of damage, but it's again up to the dice where you hit and how much damage you're going to do, and so you could roll quite high and just have that damage wasted because it doesn't carry over onto the structure. Okay, what do we have next? We have particle cutter. So I think what I want to show here is just sustained. Let's have a look at this weapon. So particle cutter, firing mode sustained, damage type raking. So this is one of those examples where those two values can be different. So damage type raking, we already know that how that works. So let's see, it hit for 23 points of damage in total. So it did 17. 22. So that was broke up into 10, 10, and 2 because this is just a normal raking weapon. 6 points of mitigation for that one. So it looks like it did 16. Okay. So it was broken up into. Oh, I can't remember quite how this worked, but we'll just take the game's word for it there. So 23 points of damage. There you go. So the 3 points of damage hit the light pulse cannon, so -2 armor, 1 damage structure, and the rest hit on the side there. So it did 1 damage to the light pulse cannon, 16 to the structure. There you go. Whew! I thought the game didn't work there, but it does. It always works. The firing mode sustained though is a bit more interesting. Actually, if we go back to turn 1 before this weapon fired, you can see it is S2, and that means it can fire 2 turns in sustained. And the particle cutter is interesting because it's always in sustained mode. But when it fires in turn 2, we'll just let that play out, you can see it goes down to S1, and that's really just to indicate to you that it can fire 2 turns in sustained. It's got 1 turn left over. When it said S2, it meant it's got 2 turns left over. And then its recharge will be 2 turns in this case. So in order to fire 2 turns in a row again, it will need to recharge for 2 turns first. So it's actually quite quick firing, quite consistent damage, as a lot of Drazi weapons have. That's how sustained works. So some weapons will always fire in sustained. Other weapons like the heavy laser can be charged to fire in sustained, but they can't start the game like that. So how this would work with the heavy laser, I think the Minbari neutron laser has the option to fire in sustained as well, is you have to charge up for its full arming cycle. So this heavy laser that I fired, I would have to charge it so it can fire sustained the next time it fires. So if it fired on turn 1, it will next fire on turn 5. I would have to put double the amount of power into that weapon every initial orders phase to make sure that it's charged and ready to fire and sustained. Now, why would I do that? Well, most people don't choose to do it because 4 turns, a lot can happen in 4 turns, and that weapon might not be there, so you wouldn't get value from firing and sustained that way. It's also quite a lot of power. You could probably use that power for something else if you wanted to. But if you did decide to do it, and the Minbari neutron laser's only got a recharge of 3 turns, you get to fire that twice. It doesn't, unlike the tabletop, the second shot doesn't automatically hit the same target. That's not been possible to implement in Fiery Void. But you still get 2 shots with a very heavy weapon. And if you think that those shots got a good chance of hitting them both times, that can do a lot of damage over 2 turns, and sure beats waiting another 4 turns before you can fire the heavy laser again. So you have the potential to do it. I'm not going to lie, it's not a popular option, but that is how sustained damage works. Actually, a quick overview of sustained damage, because I think I got lost in the detail there. Essentially, you fire it 1 turn, and you roll to hit. If you hit, you do damage. You can then, on a weapon that can fire 2 turns sustained, you can fire it again on the second turn without having to wait for it to recharge again, and that's the key point. But you still need to roll to hit again. It won't automatically hit as it would in the tabletop game, unfortunately. Okay. And the last type of weapon I fired in this round was, you can actually see it when I played this earlier, was the heavy plasma cannon. So plasma weapons, and I chose a heavy version of that. So plasma weapons, they do their damage in fire mode in standard, but they have a few characteristics, not like the matter cannon, which did damage in standard mode, which again, as a reminder just in case, is you roll to hit one location, and all the damage is done on that location until it's destroyed. If it's destroyed, any remaining damage is carried over to the structure, or indeed the primary system or primary section of the target. So it rolls to hit, hits the section. Plasma weapons, quite high damage, higher damage than other standard weapons, perhaps like particle weapons. 12 to 48. In this case, we rolled 27, 25 plus 2. So what makes plasma different from just any other standard weapon? Well, one thing, the plasma degrades over distance, so it does less damage the further away your target is. So in the case of heavy plasma cannon, every hex distance between you and the target, you lose 0.5 of damage, rounded. And so if essentially for every 2 hexes, this weapon loses 1 damage. So 12 to 48, -1 over 1 hex. Sorry, -1 if it's 2 hexes away, -2 if it's 4 hexes away, -3 if it's 6 hexes away. This target was 11. Just checking on the right ship. Yeah, 11 hexes away, so it lost 10.5. I think that's rounded. So 10 or 11 points of damage as a result. So in effect, I scored 27. I actually rolled 38 out of 48 damage on that one. But that's still quite a lot of damage on a single location. And you can see, I mean, it's hit the hull and it's done 25 points of damage. But why did a 27 point damage? Why did it do that? Well, the reason it does a little extra damage is because it halves the armor. Plasma is, I guess, corrosive, or superheated, or whatever the science behind it. Plasma weapons is, but it ignores, again, mechanically ignores half of armor. So against high armor targets, say the Brukiri, or even the Minbari or Centauri, plasma weapons can be very effective because it removes one of their advantages, and also, like, if you hit, and again, to score good damage, and generally the range penalty is pretty bad for plasma weapons. They're close range weapons, but they do a lot of damage when they hit. And I mean, if you look at the Toloth here, it's got 4 of these heavy plasma cannons. If you somehow manage to line up a ship dead in front of you, say 5-6 hexes, you could easily destroy a large vessel if they all hit and you roll decently. So very, very effective, but not without the drawbacks. Okay, so we move things on again. You can see the Jaquans continue to rotate to present hulls to us. The next thing I want to show you was just fighter weapons with a short description on how these work. So the Star Furies down here are firing some shots into the Jaquan. Oh, ignore that. Ignore that. That's for later. Let's just do the Star Furies. Okay, so the Star Furies have fired into the side of the Jaquan. They have fired the 6 of them. Each of them has a unipulse cannon which fires 2 shots. You can see number of shots 2. So in the firing we have 5 out of 6 shots hit. So 5 fighters out of the 6 fighters hit. So 10 out of 12 shots. So 5 out of 6 fighters hit. That's 10 out of 12 shots, because each fighter does 2 shots. They then, each shot does 5 to 10 damage. You can see that in the tooltip there. And so they roll against that, and they just kind of pepper across the port structure of this Jaquan heavy cruiser. A lot of fighter weapons, it doesn't actually quite say here, but a lot of fighter weapons are linked. And what essentially that means is, so the fighter fires as a fighter, and so it rolls a single location for the 2 shots from that fighter. So let's just say they hit the hull, or Yeah, looks like I would guess 3 of those 5 hit the hull. One of them hit the primary. Alright, I'm not going to guess that. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is that when a fighter hits a location, then both shots from that fighter will hit the same location, and they will both roll separately for damage, 5 to 10 in this case. And that's what it means by linked. Essentially, is each linked weapon, regardless of how many shots it's doing, although it's normally 2, only rolls once for location, and then both shots hit that location. There, that's what I was trying to say. Alright, so we're getting through it now. I've moved things on to turn 6, and that's partly because I wanted to show you how the rights and wrongs of flash damage, which is the last damage type we're going to talk through. So flash damage is essentially a ginormous explosion that affects everything in the hex. And so energy mines, for example, do sort of damage in flash because they're hitting at everything in that hex. So unlike most weapons, which only target the ship that they're fired at, flash damage also can affect other units in the hex. And we will demonstrate that with by firing the Bintax mag gun. So the mag gun is a very heavy weapon. It does damage in plasma mode. We'll come back to that. Actually, no, we'll just talk about it now. So it does, firing mode's flash, damage type is flash, but the weapon type is plasma, which means that although it does damage in flash, it also has some of the same characteristics of plasma weapon. Like in theory, it does less damage over distance, except the mag gun doesn't, because the mag gun's special, and I think it's got some sort of magnetic capsule technology that stops the plasma from degrading or something. I forget the exact fluff, but that's the gist of it. So it doesn't lose any damage over hex, and like different plasma weapons can lose different amounts of damage over the hex, which is what that demonstrates. But it does ignore half of damage. It does still have the benefit of being plasma damage. But with flash modes, so in this case I'm firing at target 3. On the same hex we have another Jaquan, target 2, and we also, quite foolishly have put in a squadron of my own fighters. So this is a mistake we all make at some point with flash damage. Let's have a look. Let's fire that. Okay, so what happened? Target 3 was a target. It got its port hull blown off because, as I say, the mag weapon, very heavy weapon, 26 to 80 points of damage there. So the hit a twin array and blew the port structure clean off by doing 51 points of damage. Looks like it probably hit the twin array first and then carried over onto the port structure. Target 2, which was also in the same hex, well, they got hit as well, and the amount of damage that's done by is less than the main target. It is 25% of the target's damage. So if I did 55 by the looks of it damage to my initial target, then a quarter of that, which seems to be around 13, hits everything else in that hex for 13 damage. So that's relatively minor for target 2. It loses an energy mine, which isn't great for it, but not terminal. Fighters, on the other hand, well, they have a much harder time of it, and you can see here that every single one of those fighters took 12 points of damage. So that was a 13. They had armor 2 on that facing. That got halved because it's a plasma weapon. So 13 minus 1, they all took 12 points of damage. And that didn't actually outright destroy them, but did so much damage, and every single one of them. And I had them evading, so evasion doesn't help you against flash damage. It doesn't do anything. It's an automatic hit if you're in that hex. And all of them dropped out, bar one, who's still flying about with missing about 3 of his wings there. So, flash damage. Always check if your weapon does flash damage, and don't move your own ships onto the hex of the same hex as the enemy you've targeted. I have lost many squadrons of fighters by not following that rule, so if I help anyone to avoid it, then you're welcome. Okay, and the video, I think at this point has probably gone on for quite a while. You can just see the slight bug there where I need to refresh the page. So the last thing I want to show you was how to select different weapon types, because some weapons have more than one firing mode. So we have a good idea of what damage types and firing modes we've got. So the battle laser, we saw that firing and piercing earlier, but that's not actually its default firing mode. Instead that's raking, the same as the heavy laser that we saw. But because it's a versatile weapon, you can choose to fire in raking or piercing. So, taking that as an example, you need to do this in firing orders generally. You left click on the tooltip and you're presented with your options. The leftmost option is the currently chosen option. So in this case R is short for, you can hover over current mode raking, set mode piercing. So if I want to set it to piercing, I need to left click on the P, you'll see it move to the leftmost side, and that means that that weapon will now fire in piercing mode. If I change my mind, just click on the R again, it moves across and it's back to raking. If you have multiple weapons of the same type, IPSHA, and you want to change them all at once, what you can do is click on the weapon and right click on the mode that you want to change to. So right click on piercing, changes it for that one, but it also changes it for this one and this one. You can see that piercing is now always on the leftmost side, and if you want to change that one to raking, that one stays piercing. But if you're going like, no, actually I want to go them all back to raking, right click on raking again, and they've all gone back to raking. And similarly for the Warlock, it has again quite versatile weapons, actually weapons that can fire as lasers or pulse arrays. Exactly the same idea. Laser is the default, change it to pulse, it's now a pulse weapon. What you'll also see here actually is allow interception. So this is worth just speaking about briefly. Weapons such as a standard particle beam which recharge in one turn will automatically try and intercept shots, providing that they're not being fired offensively. So if this gun doesn't shoot at a target and the target shoots at me and the weapon fire that's incoming can be intercepted, so lasers can't be intercepted for instance, then that gun will try and intercept it. Because it recharges in one turn, there's no loss to doing it, you might as well. But there are some weapons, the medium pulse cannon is a good example, which have an intercept rating, in this case -10, but take 2 turns to recharge. So if you want to use that, and in certain circumstances it may be beneficial, like you might really want to get the hit odds down for any incoming fire to save a ship, you have to manually select it, and that's what that is. And again, you can do that for all of them at once. I right clicked on it there, or you can do for it individually. You can see once you select them to intercept, they arm in the same way as if you had targeted an enemy ship. Okay, so that is manually selecting intercept, and that, as a general rule, is how you always choose weapon modes. Just left click on it, left click if you just want to do it for that weapon, right click if you want to do it for all weapons of that type. Okay, so I have a feeling that would probably been quite a long video. As you can imagine, these are some of the more complicated mechanics, and it is sort of worth explaining them. I probably have missed bits and bobs, but I hope to have at least given you a general idea of what the different weapon types are, damage types, and hopefully that will help you choose how to destroy your enemies in future. Thanks for watching.